The pink slip was practically vibrating with self-importance, a neon beacon of nuisance against my dark oak door. I just spent 10 hours listening to complex arguments about interstate commerce regulations, and all my brain wanted was the blissful silence of my own home. I sighed, peeling the tape off carefully. Another unapproved modification, I supposed, and unfolded it. The language was so aggressively formal it was almost comical. Aesthetic nuisance. I pictured Brenda McLemore drafting this in her perfectly sterile home. A dictionary of corporate legalese open on one side, a portrait of a frowning beige square on the other. My eyes scanned down to the description of the offending object, and that's when the laugh burst out of me. A short, sharp bark that startled a sparrow off my roof. A garden gnome. They were launching a legal crusade against a 10-inch-tall ceramic gnome named Nomeo. My daughter Lily had positioned him so his little fishing pole looked like it was casting a line into the petunia bed. It was whimsical. It was cute. It was, according to the HOA, an act of suburban terrorism. The $50 a day fine felt less like a penalty and more like a ransom note. We have your gnome. Comply or the lawn gets it. I looked from the notice to Nomeo's cheerful, painted smile. He seemed blissfully unaware of the controversy he'd sparked. This was so profoundly silly, I thought. A simple, calm conversation would clear this right up. Oh, the blissful ignorance of that moment. I had no idea I was about to declare war over a pointy red hat. I decided to handle this the way I'd approach any initial dispute, with a polite, in-person conversation. Nomeo tucked under my arm like a tiny, ceramic witness. I walked the 50 feet to Brenda's house. The walk itself was an education in HOA compliance. Every lawn was a uniform, golf course green, every shrub sculpted into a perfect, non-threatening sphere. Brenda's house was the platonic ideal of this soulless conformity. The beige siding was spotless, the black shutters looked freshly painted, and not a single leaf dared litter the immaculate walkway. It felt less like a home and more like a museum exhibit titled, Suburban Perfection. Circa now. I rang the doorbell, half expecting a robotic butler to answer. Instead, Brenda herself appeared, still in her pristine tennis whites, as if she'd just stepped out of a catalog for aggressive leisure. Her eyes immediately dropped to Nomeo, and her smile tightened into a thin, disapproving line. "David," she said, her voice a masterclass in passive aggression. "I see you've brought the violation." I launched into my prepared, reasonable spiel about it being a child's decoration, harmless and temporary. I even gestured with Nomeo for emphasis, his cheerful face a stark contrast to her stony expression. She listened, but I could tell she wasn't hearing a word. She was just waiting for her turn to recite the bylaws. When she invoked precedent and the terrifying specter of a tasteful burgundy door, I knew I wasn't dealing with a rational actor. This was a zealot. Her final words, "The board's interpretation is final," hung in the air between us, a declaration of absolute power. I left, placing Nomeo back on his small patch of turf, understanding now that this was no longer a discussion. It was a test of wills. The next pink slip arrived before I'd even finished my morning coffee, as if delivered by some spectral agent of petty bureaucracy. This one was more severe, its language shifting from condescending warning to outright threat. It mentioned accelerated enforcement and liens. A lien for a garden gnome. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of it was almost impressive. I decided to pay the first fine, a tactical move. I included a polite, meticulously worded letter explaining that the gnome was a temporary, movable decoration, not a fixture, and thus fell outside the bylaw's scope. I sent it certified mail because even in my irritation, I believe in creating a paper trail. The response was a masterstroke of arrogance. My check was cashed, but my letter was returned, stamped in angry red ink with a single word, "Denied." No explanation, no reasoning, just a bureaucratic door slammed in my face. The daily fines continued to pile up in my mailbox, each notice more menacing than the last. They started citing obscure clauses about maintaining the community's character and preventing blight, as if Nomeo were a rusted-out car on cinder blocks and not a smiling figure with a fishing pole. That's when the initial spark of annoyance hardened into cold, focused resolve. They weren't interested in dialogue or reason. They were flexing their power, and they expected me to kneel. But I've spent my entire career looking powerful people in the eye and asking, "Says who?" The petty tyrant of Whispering Pines had just filed her first motion, and it was time for me to prepare my response. The game, as they say, was afoot. The daily arrival of those pink slips became a ritual of absurdity. But my initial frustration had now crystallized into a cold, methodical purpose. I am, at my core, an analyst of conflict and a curator of evidence. Brenda had chosen to fight this war with paperwork and threats. She had no idea she was up against a professional. The first thing I did was install a small, discreet security camera above my front door, its field of view perfectly capturing my mailbox, Nomeo, and the sidewalk. I wasn't just being paranoid. I was creating a verifiable record. I started a log, a simple spreadsheet at first, but it quickly grew in complexity. I documented the time and content of every violation notice, recorded the weather, in case they tried to claim weather-related damage from the gnome, who knows, and even began noting Brenda's own comings and goings. It was during this surveillance that I struck petty gold. Brenda, while walking her perfectly coiffed poodle muffins, allowed the little beast to defecate squarely in my petunia bed. She glanced around, saw no one, and simply tugged the leash, continuing her march of supremacy. I smiled, zooming in on the crystal-clear footage. Bylaw 9.2. Pet waste must be promptly and sanitarily removed. Noted. But the real work began at night. I poured a glass of Cabernet, opened my laptop, and dived into the breathtakingly dull abyss of the Whispering Pines CC and RS. I read about fence heights, shutter colors, and the morally reprehensible act of leaving a garbage can visible from the street. I was no longer just a homeowner. I was becoming a ghost of suburban compliance, and I was learning the rules better than the people who wrote them. My evening deep dives into the CC and RS transformed from a chore into a thrilling treasure hunt. I was no longer just looking for a loophole for Nomeo. I was building a profile. I cross-referenced the bylaws with public county records, zoning permits, and even a little light social media stalking. And Brenda McLemore, the high priestess of compliance, was a fraud. The scale of her hypocrisy was breathtaking. It started with the shed, a hulking prefab structure visible from the alley behind her house. A quick search of the county's online permit portal showed nothing. The Architectural Review Committee had no record of any submission. Bylaw 8.7 was crystal clear. No structure erected without approval. Then I stumbled upon the motherlode. A friend mentioned a charming Whispering Pines cottage on a rental site. I found it instantly. The listing photos showed Brenda's own furniture, her distinct, soulless decor. The property was deeded to her husband, and Bylaw 12.1 explicitly forbade rentals without board approval, an approval she would have had to grant herself. The fence around her pool was an obvious violation, a towering monolith of privacy that scoffed at the 6-foot limit. And the political sign for Sheriff Thompson? It had become a permanent, rusting fixture, a clear breach of the 30-day rule. I compiled it all into a digital dossier. Photos, links, PDFs of the bylaws highlighted in yellow. She hadn't just broken a rule. She had built her entire reign on a foundation of ignored regulations. My little gnome was a pebble. Brenda's violations were a landslide waiting to happen. The community clubhouse hummed with a tense, gossipy energy. I took a seat in the back, my plain black folder on my lap. Brenda called the meeting to order, her voice crisp with authority. She sped through the mundane agenda items, her eyes flicking to me occasionally, a predator anticipating an easy kill. Finally, she adjusted her glasses. Now to the matter of 1421 Willow Lane. The board has voted to initiate lien proceedings to recover the $1,850 in outstanding fines for repeated, willful violations. A murmur rippled through the room. Mrs. Gable shot me a worried look. Brenda turned her triumphant gaze on me. "David, this is your final chance. Will you remove the item?" I stood slowly, the calm I feel at the bench settling over me. "Brenda, I'd like to discuss the rules." I began, my voice even. She sighed with theatrical impatience. We're all familiar with the rules. I'm not sure you are, I countered pleasantly. I held up the first photo. Bylaw 9.2. Bait waste. This is your dog, Muffins, in my petunia bed at 4:17 p.m. last Tuesday. You failed to remediate. That's a $50 fine. The room tittered. Brenda's face flushed. This is absurd. Is it? I held up the next image. Bylaw 8.7. Unapproved structures. Your backyard shed. No arksebmischen exists. The fine for that is $500. I could see the other board members shifting uncomfortably. And Bylaw 12.1. I continued, holding up the Airbnb listing. The rental property at 1437 Magnolia. That's a $100 per day violation. You've accrued over $12,000 in fines by my conservative estimate. Brenda shot to her feet, her chair screeching. You have no right. These are lies. I'm calling our attorney. We will see you in court. I let the silence hang for a beat, then delivered the final, quiet blow. Brenda, as a United States federal judge, I am intimately familiar with court procedure. I suggest you reconsider. I have documented every one of your violations. The selective enforcement, the hypocrisy, it leaves you and the entire board exposed to significant liability. The gasp in the room was audible. Brenda didn't just freeze. She seemed to deflate, her jaw slack, all the color draining from her face. The gavel of reality had finally dropped. The silence in the room was so profound you could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. Brenda didn't just freeze. She seemed to short-circuit, her mouth opening and closing without a sound. Her eyes wide with a mixture of sheer terror and dawning professional ruin. The other board members, who moments before had been her loyal cabinet, now looked at her as if she were radioactive, physically leaning away from the blast radius. The meeting dissolved into chaos, not of shouting, but of frantic, hushed conversations. I simply sat back down, the folder of evidence closed on my lap. I didn't need to say another word. The following days were a masterclass in swift, quiet justice. Brenda's resignation was emailed to the community by the next morning, citing a desire to spend more time with family. The lien against my property was voided so fast the paper might as well have been on fire. The HOA's attorney, a man who suddenly became very interested in equitable solutions, personally called to assure me all fines had been refunded and that my concerns about selective enforcement were being taken very, very seriously. A special election was held, and sweet Mrs. Gable, who had always quietly hated the beige tyranny, was voted in as the new president. Her first official act was to pass what the neighborhood now calls the Nomeo Amendment, formally exempting small, non-permanent decorations from the architectural review process. Now, the street has slowly begun to bloom with personality. A flamingo here, a whimsical wind chime there. The oppressive, uniform silence has been broken. And Nomeo? He still stands guard, his fishing line eternally cast. He's a little weathered now, but he's a permanent fixture in the best sense of the word. A small ceramic monument to the idea that sometimes you have to fight for the little things, even if you happen to wield the biggest gavel in the land.